The wind, a thin, keening sound across the endless plains, was the first true welcome Ilara received in the town of Redemption Gulch. It whipped her threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders and stung her eyes, blurring the hard edges of the dusty street and the raw timber buildings that seemed to crouch under the vast, indifferent sky. Her valise, clutched in one raw-boned hand, contained all she owned: a change of dress, her mother's locket, and a packet of letters, their paper softened with countless readings, promising a new life, a husband, a home. Jedediah Fuller. His name, once a beacon of hope, now felt like a stone in her throat. She had traveled for weeks, propelled by the fragile wings of that hope, imagining a kind face, a sturdy arm to lean on after a life of too much solitude and too little kindness. The stagecoach lurched to a final, jarring halt before a building grander than the others, its sign proclaiming Fuller's Mercantile, Town Provisions. This was it. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs, a wild bird desperate for escape. Passengers disembarked, stretching, grumbling, their faces smudged with dust and weariness. Ilara waited, her gaze searching, until a man stepped from the Mercantile's shaded porch. He was portly, dressed in a waistcoat that strained across his middle, his face florid, his eyes small and assessing. He scanned the arrivals, his lips pursed. "You'll be looking for Mr. Fuller," she managed, her voice barely a whisper, lost almost immediately in the bustle. He turned his gaze upon her, a slow, deliberate inventory that made her shrink. "I am Jedediah Fuller." His voice was unexpectedly resonant, a merchant's voice used to command. He looked at the letter she timidly extended, then back at her face, lingering on her downcast eyes, her nervous tremor. A frown creased his brow. This is you, Ilara Thornton?" She nodded, a small, jerky movement. A flicker of something cold and dismissive entered his eyes. "Well now, the letters spoke of a woman of good character. They did not mention this." He gestured vaguely at her whole being, her quietude, her obvious fright. "I am Ilara," she whispered again, a desperate plea for recognition, for the dream to solidify. Jedediah Fuller puffed out his chest. "I require a wife, madam, not a shadow. A woman to stand beside me, to manage a household with spirit, someone with fortitude. This territory is no place for the timid. You are too shy, far too shy. This will not do. This will not do at all." His voice rose, carrying to the onlookers who had begun to gather, their faces a mixture of curiosity and cruel amusement. Ilara felt the blood drain from her face. The world tilted, but the letters, the agreement, each word was a shard of glass. The agreement, he scoffed, waving a dismissive hand, was based on a certain understanding, an understanding of suitability. "You, madam, are clearly unsuitable." He turned, as if to dismiss her entirely. "I have a business to run. I cannot be saddled with a frightened mouse." The public nature of his rejection was a physical blow. Humiliation washed over her, hot and suffocating. Tears pricked her eyes, but she fought them back, a small, trembling bastion of pride in the face of utter desolation. Around her, she felt the stares, heard a snicker, a murmured comment. The town of Redemption Gulch, which was to be her sanctuary, had become her pillory. Jedediah Fuller, her promised husband, was her accuser and judge. She was left standing alone on the dusty thoroughfare, the meager weight of her valise, the only solid thing in a world that had just crumbled beneath her feet. The hope she had nurtured for so long lay shattered, glinting like broken glass in the harsh afternoon sun. For a time, Ilara did not move. She simply stood, a small, forlorn figure amidst the uncaring flow of frontier life. The stagecoach rumbled away, carrying with it the last vestiges of her known world. Men in wide-brimmed hats and dusty boots passed by, some sparing her a curious glance, others ignoring her completely. Women, their faces etched with the harshness of the land, clutched their children's hands and hurried past, their skirts whispering disapproval. The mercantile door remained firmly shut. Jedediah Fuller had retreated into his domain, leaving her exposed and adrift. The sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, colors too beautiful for the ugliness of her situation. A chill crept into the air, mirroring the ice forming around her heart. Where could she go? What could she do? She had no money for a room, even if an innkeeper would take pity on a woman so publicly spurned. The letters in her valise, once sources of comfort, now seemed like cruel taunts. Each carefully penned word from Jedediah, promising welcome and a shared future, was a lie. She finally moved, her limbs stiff and heavy, as if she waded through deep water. She walked, with no destination in mind, away from the main street, towards the edge of the settlement, where the buildings grew sparser, rougher. The vast, unforgiving landscape stretched before her, a panorama of scrub and distant, shadowed mesas. It seemed to reflect her own inner desolation, empty and full of unseen perils. She found a semblance of shelter behind a stack of forgotten lumber near a half-finished structure, the wind whistling through the gaps, a mournful song. Here, hidden from most eyes, she finally allowed the tears to fall, silent, burning tracks down her dust-stained cheeks. Loneliness, a familiar companion from her past, wrapped its cold arms around her. From the quiet of his small, weathered cabin set back from the main track into Redemption Gulch, Silas Blackwood had seen the stage arrive. He had seen the woman, small and neatly dressed, her face pale with a mixture of hope and trepidation. He had also seen Jedediah Fuller, a man whose piety Silas had long mistrusted, meet her. He had not heard the words, but Fuller's dismissive gestures, his puffed-up indignation, and the woman's subsequent collapse into visible despair told a clear enough story. Silas was a man of few words, his own life etched with loss that had carved deep lines into his face and left a permanent shadow in his grey eyes. He was an outsider by choice and by circumstance, content with the company of the land and his own thoughts. He knew the casual cruelty of men like Fuller and the sharp sting of societal judgment. He watched as Ilara wandered, a lost soul, towards the rougher edges of the town. He saw her settle behind the lumber stack, a small, huddled shape as dusk gathered. He felt a familiar ache in his chest, a kinship with her vulnerability. He did not approach immediately. He was not a man to intrude, nor one to offer comfort easily. But he could not simply leave her to the night and the cold. Later, under the cloak of a moonless night, he moved with the quiet tread of a man accustomed to the wilderness. He left a folded blanket, thick and warm, near where she lay, and a canteen of fresh water. He did not linger. The next morning, before the town fully stirred, he left a small bundle of bread and dried meat in the same spot. He observed from a distance, saw her tentative discovery of the items, the confusion, then the desperate relief in her movements as she drank and ate. For 2 days this silent provision continued. Ilara, though still deeply shaken, began to look for his unseen charity. She never saw him, but she felt a presence, a thread of unexpected kindness in this desolate place. On the 3rd day, as a raw wind picked up, carrying the threat of a coming storm, Silas knew he had to do more. He found her shivering, her face etched with exhaustion and a growing despair. He approached slowly, so as not to startle her. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low and a little rough from disuse. Ilara jumped, her eyes wide with fear, like a cornered deer. She clutched her shawl tighter. "The storm will be bad," Silas continued, his gaze steady, holding no threat, only a quiet concern. "You can't stay out here." He paused, then added, "I have a cabin. It's dry and warm." She stared at him, suspicion warring with desperation in her eyes. Another man. After Fuller's cruelty, trusting anyone felt impossible. Yet, this man's eyes, they were different. They held a sorrow she recognized, a weariness that mirrored her own, and he was the source of the blanket, the water, the food. He had shown her kindness when the world had offered only scorn. The wind howled, a mournful cry, and a few icy drops of rain spattered against the lumber. The decision was made for her as much by the elements as by the flicker of intuition that told her this stranger, this rugged, silent man, was not like Jedediah Fuller. With a barely perceptible nod, a surrender to fate, and a desperate, fragile hope, she accepted. Silas led her away from the town, along a path almost invisible to an untrained eye. His cabin was small, built of rough-hewn logs, nestled amongst a stand of hardy pines that offered some protection from the wind. Smoke curled from its stone chimney, a thin grey ribbon against the bruised sky. Inside, it was Spartan but clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. A rough table and 2 chairs stood in the center, and a narrow cot was tucked into a corner. Another sleeping pallet, clearly his, lay on the floor near the hearth. The air smelled of wood smoke and something faintly herbal. The initial hours were filled with a thick, cautious silence. Ilara sat on the edge of the cot, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, watching Silas as he moved about the small space, adding wood to the fire, checking the shutters against the rising wind. He offered her a tin mug of hot, bitter coffee, which she accepted with a trembling hand. He did not press her with questions, did not pry into her humiliation. He simply existed in the space with her, a solid, unassuming presence. This quiet respect was a balm to her shattered nerves. Days bled into one another. The storm passed, leaving the air crisp and clean. Ilara, slowly, tentatively, began to emerge from her shell of shock and grief. She started by tidying the small cabin, sweeping the wooden floor with a worn broom she found, folding Silas's few spare clothes. These small acts were an attempt to repay his kindness, to feel useful, to reclaim some small piece of herself. Silas accepted her efforts with a quiet nod, never making her feel like a burden. He would leave for hours at a time, tending to his traps or hunting, always returning with something for the pot, a rabbit, a few birds. He taught her, with patient gestures and few words, how to prepare them, how to recognize edible roots and berries he brought back. Communication remained minimal, yet a language grew between them, woven from shared tasks and small, unspoken kindnesses. He would find a late autumn wildflower on his wanderings and leave it in a tin cup on the table. She, in turn, noticed a tear in his heavy work shirt and mended it meticulously, her stitches small and neat. She learned his habits, the way he stared into the fire at night, lost in thoughts he never voiced, the gentleness of his large, calloused hands as he handled a wounded bird he found. He, in turn, saw the resilience beneath her shyness, the intelligence in her observant eyes, the deep well of sadness that sometimes clouded them. He noticed she carried a small, worn book of poetry, and one evening he simply nodded towards it. Hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence, she began to read aloud, her soft voice filling the quiet cabin, a counterpoint to the crackling fire and the sigh of the wind outside. One evening, as the fire cast dancing shadows on the rough log walls, Ilara found herself speaking, the words tumbling out, soft and halting at first. She told him of her small, constrained life before Redemption Gulch, of her hopes for a new beginning, of the crushing weight of Jedediah Fuller's rejection. She did not cry, but her voice trembled with the memory of it. Silas listened, his gaze fixed on the flames, his silence an invitation rather than an interruption. When she finished, a profound quiet settled between them. Then he spoke, his voice low. "Lost my wife and son, fever, years back." He did not elaborate, but the stark words, filled with an ocean of unspoken grief, resonated deeply within Ilara. She understood then the source of the sorrow in his eyes, the reason for his solitude. It was a shared vulnerability, a quiet acknowledgement of past wounds that forged a new, stronger link in the tentative chain of trust between them. The cabin, once just a refuge from the storm, began to feel like something more, a sanctuary. A fragile normalcy began to weave itself into the fabric of their days. Ilara found a rhythm in the small routines of the cabin. She tended the fire, cooked their simple meals, and kept the single room as neat as her mother had taught her. Silas, noticing her interest in a small, fallow patch of earth behind the cabin, tilled it for her with his spade. He found a forgotten packet of seeds in his meager supplies, beans and hardy greens, and she planted them with a care that spoke of a deep-seated need to nurture, to create life in this harsh land. Watching the tiny green shoots push through the soil became a quiet joy, a symbol of her own tentative regrowth. The unspoken commitment between them deepened. It was not a bond of passion, but of mutual reliance, of shared solitude that was no longer quite so lonely. When Silas returned from his traplines, often cold and weary, the sight of smoke from the chimney and the warm glow from the window was a welcome he had not known for years. For Ilara, his steady presence was an anchor in a world that had tried to cast her adrift. The sharp edges of her fear began to soften, and glimmers of a quiet contentment, something she had not dared to hope for, flickered within her. Her shyness remained, a part of her nature, but it was no longer the paralyzing terror it had been. In Silas's accepting silence, she found a space to simply be. But the outside world could not be kept at bay forever. Redemption Gulch, though small, was a hive of gossip and judgment. Silas needed supplies, and occasionally Ilara would accompany him, walking a little behind, her gaze mostly on the ground, but her senses alert. It was inevitable that they would be seen. Jedediah Fuller, his pride still smarting from the unsuitable bride who had then, in his view, so quickly found comfort with a reclusive trapper, was the first to make his displeasure known. He saw them near the mercantile, Silas buying flour and salt, Ilara standing quietly by his side. Fuller's lip curled. "Well, well," he boomed, ensuring others could hear. "It seems the timid mouse has found a den, and with such a rustic protector." His eyes raked over Ilara, insinuating, contemptuous. "Some women have no shame." Ilara flinched, color flooding her cheeks. The old humiliation threatened to engulf her, but before she could shrink away, Silas stepped slightly in front of her, his body a quiet shield. He did not raise his voice, did not betray any anger, but his grey eyes, when they met Fuller's, were like chips of winter ice. "She's with me, Fuller," Silas stated, his voice flat, devoid of emotion but carrying an undeniable finality. "Mind your own business." Fuller, taken aback by the directness from a man usually so reserved, spluttered. "With you? Living in sin, more like. What will the good people of this town think? What will Pastor Brown say about such an arrangement?" He clearly intended to stir up trouble, to use the town's rigid morality as a weapon. Whispers had already started, of course. Ilara had felt the curious, condemning stares. The women, in particular, looked at her with a mixture of suspicion and disdain. Silas did not waver. He looked Fuller squarely in the eye. "What folks think is their concern. She is under my roof and under my protection." He paused, then added, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden hush that had fallen around them. "If anyone has a problem with that, they answer to me." It was not a boast, but a simple statement of fact, delivered with an intensity that brooked no argument. He then turned, took Ilara's arm gently but firmly, and led her away, leaving Jedediah Fuller fuming and the onlookers buzzing with speculation. That day, something shifted. Silas had not just offered her shelter. He had publicly claimed her, defended her. The act was a bulwark against the rising tide of societal disapproval, a declaration that, in his small corner of the world, she belonged. Jedediah Fuller, however, was not a man to be easily thwarted, especially when his public standing and his deeply ingrained sense of self-importance were challenged. Silas's quiet defiance had pricked his pride, and the sight of Ilara, no longer looking quite so broken, living under the protection of a man Fuller considered beneath him, was a festering wound. He began to subtly poison the well of public opinion, painting Silas as a reclusive, perhaps even dangerous character, and Ilara as a woman of loose morals, easily swayed. He insinuated that Silas had taken advantage of her vulnerability, perhaps even holding her against her will. The whispers grew louder, bolder. Pastor Brown, a man whose stern pronouncements often held more judgment than compassion, began to preach sermons on the sanctity of marriage and the evils of unconventional living arrangements, his gaze often drifting towards the path that led to Silas's cabin. Some of the more self-righteous townsfolk started to give Silas and Ilara overtly hostile stares when they came for supplies. The fragile peace they had cultivated felt increasingly threatened. The crisis materialized not as a direct attack, but through a cunning manipulation of the law, or what passed for it in Redemption Gulch. Fuller, using his influence as a prominent merchant, convinced the newly appointed and somewhat easily swayed town marshal, a man named Griggs, that there was cause for concern. He fabricated a story that Silas Blackwood was squatting on land that had a prior, albeit disputed, claim. A claim Fuller now conveniently remembered was tied to an old trading post charter he had acquired. His aim was clear: to drive Silas off the land, leaving Ilara unprotected and vulnerable once more, perhaps even to rescue her himself and thus restore his tarnished image. Marshal Griggs, accompanied by Fuller and a couple of Fuller's cronies masquerading as concerned citizens, arrived at Silas's cabin one cold morning. The autumn air was sharp, and the sky overhead was a hard, metallic grey. Silas was splitting wood, the rhythmic thud of his axe a familiar sound. Ilara was inside, kneading dough for their daily bread, the scent of yeast and wood smoke filling the small space. "Blackwood," Griggs called out, his voice attempting an authority it didn't quite possess. "Got some questions for you, about this land." Silas lowered his axe, his face unreadable. He saw Fuller smirking behind the marshal. Ilara appeared in the doorway, her eyes wide with apprehension, flour dusting her hands. "This is my land," Silas said, his voice calm but firm. "Built this cabin myself, cleared it myself." "Well now, there seems to be some dispute about that," Fuller interjected smoothly, stepping forward. "Marshal Griggs has papers here suggesting a prior claim. My claim, as it happens, and frankly, Blackwood, there's also the matter of this woman." He gestured towards Ilara. "Concerns have been raised for her welfare. Living out here with you, a man of uncertain reputation." Ilara felt a surge of anger, hot and fierce, replacing her fear. This man, who had publicly humiliated her, now feigned concern. She stepped forward, out from the shadow of the doorway, no longer the timid creature who had arrived in Redemption Gulch. "My welfare is not your concern, Mr. Fuller," she said, her voice clear and surprisingly steady. "I am here by my own choice. Mr. Blackwood has shown me nothing but kindness and respect, qualities you seem to sorely lack." Fuller's face darkened. "The woman is clearly confused, Marshal, perhaps even coerced." Silas moved to stand beside Ilara, a silent, unshakable presence. "She speaks her own mind, Fuller, and this land is mine. I ain't leaving." His hand rested near the handle of his axe, not as a threat, but as a statement of intent. He would protect his home, and he would protect Ilara. The shared fear of this confrontation, and their unified stance against it, forged an even deeper bond between them. Ilara felt his resolve, drew strength from it, and offered her own in return. The lines were drawn. The small cabin, their sanctuary, had become a battleground. The air crackled with tension. Marshal Griggs shifted uncomfortably, the legal papers in his hand suddenly feeling flimsy against the combined moral weight of Ilara's quiet dignity and Silas's resolute stance. Jedediah Fuller, however, pressed his advantage, his voice rising in sanctimonious fervor. "This is an outrage. This man defies the law, harbors a woman of questionable character. Are we to let such lawlessness prevail in Redemption Gulch?" He looked to his two companions, rough-looking men who shifted their weight, ready to enforce Fuller's will if the marshal faltered. It was then that Ilara spoke again, her voice ringing with a conviction that surprised everyone, perhaps even herself. "Lawlessness, Mr. Fuller." She challenged, stepping forward so she was clearly visible, her eyes, no longer downcast, meeting his directly. Was it lawful to invite a woman across a continent with false promises, only to cast her aside like unwanted baggage because she did not fit your narrow expectations of a wife? Was it lawful to humiliate her publicly, to leave her destitute and alone? That, sir, is the only lawlessness I have witnessed here. Her words, sharp and true, hung in the cold air. A few townsfolk, drawn by the commotion, had gathered at a distance, listening intently. Among them were some who had initially judged Ilara, but now saw the scene with new eyes. They saw Fuller's vindictive spite, and they saw the quiet strength of the two people standing before their humble home, defending not just land, but their right to exist in peace. "Silas Blackwood took me in when I had nowhere else to go," Ilara continued, her voice gaining power. "He offered me shelter, food, and respect, things you, Mr. Fuller, with all your wealth and standing, denied me. He has never asked for anything in return. If this is what you call uncertain reputation, then I pray for more men of such character in this world." She turned to Marshal Griggs. "This cabin is our home, Marshal. We have harmed no one. We ask only to be left in peace." Silas placed a hand on her shoulder, a gesture of unwavering support. He looked at Griggs. "The woman has spoken the truth. As for this land, Fuller knows my claim is just. He's a liar and a bully." He then looked directly at Fuller's two cronies. "And if you think to lay a hand on her or this cabin, you'll deal with me first." There was no bluster in his tone, only the cold promise of a man pushed too far. A long silence followed. Marshal Griggs looked from Fuller's purpling face to Ilara's unwavering gaze, then to Silas's grim determination. He saw the faces of the onlookers, their expressions shifting from curiosity to a dawning respect for the pair at the cabin, and a visible disdain for Fuller's actions. One older woman, Mistress Albright, known for her sharp tongue but fair mind, called out, "Leave them be, Marshal. Fuller's just stirring trouble 'cause his pride was pricked. Silas Blackwood's a decent man, always has been, quiet or not." Another man, a blacksmith whose forge was near Silas's trapping route, nodded in agreement. "Aye, Silas keeps to himself, but he's honest. More than can be said for some merchants I know." The tide of public opinion, fickle as it was, had turned. Fuller's support evaporated. His cronies looked uneasy, unwilling to escalate the confrontation without clear backing. Marshal Griggs, seeing his authority undermined by Fuller's obvious malice and the community's nascent support for Silas and Ilara, made a decision. He lowered the papers. "Well, Mr. Fuller," he said slowly, "it seems this land dispute is more complicated than you initially presented. And as for the lady, she seems quite capable of speaking for herself and making her own choices." He cleared his throat. "I see no cause for further action here today." Jedediah Fuller sputtered, his face a mask of fury and thwarted ambition, but the fight had gone out of him. He was exposed, his hypocrisy laid bare. With a final, venomous glare at Ilara and Silas, he turned and stalked away, his companions trailing sheepishly behind him. The threat, for now, had been neutralized. Ilara sagged slightly against Silas, a wave of exhaustion and relief washing over her. He kept his hand on her shoulder, a steadying presence. They had faced the worst, together, and they had, against the odds, prevailed. In the immediate aftermath of the confrontation, a profound quiet settled over Silas's homestead, broken only by the sigh of the wind through the pines. The relief was palpable, a heavy weight lifted from their shoulders. Jedediah Fuller, his public shaming complete, retreated into a sullen silence within his mercantile, his influence in Redemption Gulch significantly diminished. The townsfolk who had witnessed the exchange, and those who heard of it later, now viewed Ilara and Silas with a newfound respect. Their courage and integrity had spoken louder than any gossip. With the threat abated, Ilara and Silas slowly began to build a more permanent existence. The small patch of garden Ilara had tended so carefully yielded a modest harvest, a tangible reward for their shared labor. Silas, with Ilara's help, reinforced the cabin against the coming winter, chinking the logs more tightly, building sturdier shutters. The dwelling, once a mere temporary refuge, began to feel like a true home, imbued with their shared experiences and the quiet strength of their bond. They were no longer just two solitary individuals occupying the same space, but partners, their lives interwoven by hardship, respect, and a deep, unspoken affection. The community's acceptance, though gradual, was genuine. Mistress Albright made it a point to stop by with a freshly baked pie, her gruff kindness a welcome gesture. The blacksmith offered Silas a fair price for his pelts, and even engaged him in brief, friendly conversation. Children, who had once stared with fearful curiosity, now sometimes waved shyly as Ilara worked in her garden. She was no longer Fuller's rejected bride or Silas Blackwood's woman. She was Ilara, a quiet, resilient presence who had earned her place. And Silas, once the reclusive trapper, was seen as a man of quiet honor, a protector. Ilara found a profound sense of inner peace she had never known. Her shyness, though still a part of her gentle nature, no longer held her captive. It had transformed into a quiet thoughtfulness, a deep capacity for observation and empathy. She had found her voice, not in loud pronouncements, but in the steady assertion of her worth and the quiet courage of her convictions. She realized her value was not determined by a suitor's approval or societal expectations, but by her own inner strength, her resilience, and her capacity for love and kindness. Their found family, initially just the two of them against the world, slowly expanded in small ways. One harsh winter day, a young boy, orphaned and half-frozen, stumbled to their cabin. Without hesitation, Ilara and Silas took him in, sharing their meager provisions, nursing him back to health. He stayed, becoming a son to them in all but blood, his laughter filling the small cabin, a testament to the warmth and safety they had created. Ilara, who had once dreamed of being a wife, found herself a mother, her nurturing instincts blossoming. She extended her quiet kindness to others who found themselves on the fringes, offering a warm drink, a mended garment, a listening ear. Their home became a small beacon of compassion in a harsh land. One evening, as the first stars pricked the twilight sky, Ilara and Silas sat on the small porch they had added to the cabin. The young boy slept soundly inside. A comfortable silence lay between them, the kind that needs no words. Ilara leaned her head against Silas's shoulder, a gesture of complete trust and affection. He covered her hand with his own, his touch gentle but firm. The rugged settler had not just shown her her true worth. He had given her a place to let it shine, a home where her quiet spirit could flourish. The harsh frontier, once a landscape of desolation and fear, now held the promise of a future, hard-won, but deeply precious, built not on grand pronouncements or societal approval, but on the enduring power of kindness, resilience, and a love that had found its voice in the quiet spaces between two hearts.